morning. Yes, Mr. Wilcox?
Yes, Your Honour.
Can we have a new person at the bar table?
Yes, I'll just take your appearance, thanks.
Your Honour, James initial L. I seek leave to appear on behalf of the affected residents of Mount Wilson in place of Mr. Searle for today.
Yes, leave is granted. Thank you, Mr. James. Mr. Wilcox?
I call Elizabeth Rains.
Yes. Good morning, Ms. Rains. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, I can.
All right, you'll just hear from the court officer now.
Silence, please. Do you solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth? If so, please say, I do.
I do.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Wilcox.
Would you please state your full name, occupation and professional address?
Sorry. Elizabeth Jane Rains, Field Supervisor, Enhanced Bushfire Management Team with the National Parks and Wildlife Service, based at Blackheath, Govett Sleep Road.
Did you provide a statement to this inquiry dated 3rd of June 2020?
Yes, I did.
Is there anything you wish to amend, correct or add to in that statement? You currently work with the National Parks and Wildlife Service as an employee, is that correct?
That's correct.
And how long have you been under the employ of that service?
I started employment at November 2012.
What was your role with National Parks and Wildlife Service during the 2019-2020 bushfire season?
I was working as a field supervisor. I also did remote area firefighting during that fire season, anywhere from Glen Innes and then also Gospers Mountain Fire.
Where was your National Parks and Wildlife Service office during that fire season?
It was at Blackheath, but I was sent wherever I was needed.
Are you involved with the Rural Fire Service in a volunteering or other capacity?
Yes, I'm volunteer with the Rural Fire Service. I'm a member of the Mount Wilson Mount Irvine Rural Fire Brigade. I joined in 1999 and then became captain in 2008.
And you had that same position during the 2019-2020 fire season, is that right?
Correct.
Can you tell the court about your involvement with respect to the Gospers Mountain fire after it started in late October 2019 and then up until the 14th of December 2019?
So my involvement in Gospers Mountain started at Gospers Mountain on the first week of that fire, doing remote area firefighting, doing suppression of that fire around Gospers Mountain. After that, we moved to around Glen Davis and worked around suppression of the fire there. We also worked around...
Sorry, Glen Davis?
Glen Davis, sort of between Lithgow and Rylstone.
Thank you.
Capity Valley. Yep. And from there went to Colo Heights in November when the fire progressed further to the east.
And how had firefighting authorities you were involved with managed trying to contain the Gospers Mountain fire during that October-November period?
From my point of view, everything was done to try and contain that fire and limit its spread. Resources were stretched across the state at that time, and so aerial support was probably not as readily available as it would have been if fires weren't, spread throughout the state at that time.
Did weather and terrain make firefighting against the Gospers Mountain fire difficult in that time?
That's correct. It was very dry, so any fuel was available. Fuel loads were high, weather conditions were dry, creek lines were dry. A lot of the containment options that I observed in my time that season were not working.
What preparation work were you asked to do specifically in the Mount Wilson, Mount Irvine, Bell area, and by whom in that period of October to December 2019?
So at the end of November, I was asked to start working on preparing the trails around the mountain towns of Mount Tomah, Mount Irvine, Mount Wilson and Bell in my capacity of National Parks and Wildlife. So I'm in organised heavy plant, so that's graders, dozers, skid steer loaders with vegetation management to clear the trails in preparation for potential backburning operations from Bilpin towards Bell.
And was the incident management team the organisation that directed that type of work?
Correct.
And that's the Hawkesbury IMTs?
That's correct. I reported back to the plant supervisor at the Hawkesbury Fire Control Centre and reported back to the Hawkesbury IMT.
And that's the IMT set up in response to the Gospers Mountain fire, correct?
That's correct.
Moving then to the 5th of December 2019, did you have conversations with the IMT about trigger points for a backburn?
That's correct. So we had conversations with the Hawkesbury IMT, members of Blue Mountains Rural Fire Service and National Parks and Wildlife Service about potential trigger points for when we would commence backburning operations from Bilpin to Mount Irvine to Mount Wilson to Bell.
And in those conversations, were you acting in capacity as the working under National Parks and Wildlife Service or as the captain of the Mount Wilson and Mount Irvine Brigade?
I was representing the Mount Wilson Fire Brigade at the time.
And what trigger points were identified as at early December 2019?
So they were grid references. I have to refer to my statement.
Paragraph 8.
Yeah, so generally, if the Gospers Mountain fire crossed the 99 northing, which refers to a grid reference on a map, it was agreed that the backburning would commence. There was a trigger point also was if the Bilpin backburn crossed over at Mount Tootie, that backburning would commence at Mount Irvine.
Is Mount Tootie generally to the east of Mount Wilson and Mount Irvine?
Yes.
Was there rainfall on 11th of December 2019 which affected the plan?
That's correct. So they weren't able to continue the backburn around Mount Tootie towards towards Bowens Creek Road.
Around that time, 11th and 12th of December 2019, when did you understand that the backburn specifically protecting Mount Wilson and Mount Irvine was to be put in place?
As far as we know, as far as we were aware, that the plan with those trigger points was still standing up until the 13th.
And who do you mean by we?
The brigade.
That's your brigade, Mount Wilson and Mount Irvine.
Yep, and that's what we'd also told our community.
So given that knowledge and that trigger point, as at the 11th of 12th of December, when did you anticipate the backburn for Mount Wilson would be put in?
We weren't anticipating until those trigger points had been met.
Any particular date or day that you anticipated the trigger points would be met?
No, because it was very weather dependent. It depended on what the fire was doing out in the Wallamai National Park to whether it would cross over those trigger points.
So is it fair to say that the prevailing weather is a very important factor in terms of when to implement a backburn, both in terms of its capacity for success and also for its capacity to protect communities ahead of worsening weather?
Very much so.
When did you first become aware of the plan to implement the backburn on the 14th of December 2019?
It was around the middle of the day on the 13th, Friday the 13th. And I heard through the Bell captain that live traffic had updated that Bell's line of road would be closed.
And who's the Bell captain at that time?
Greg Honeysett.
Were you involved in a meeting with the Hawkesbury IMT later on in the day on the 13th of December 2019?
Yes, I was, and also my senior deputy, Peter Rains, is also my brother.
Does it sound correct that you were dialed into a teleconference about 4:56 p.m. that day?
That's correct.
Do you know who was participating in the conference at that time?
Can't recall all the people involved, but Karen Hodges was there, Jamie Carter, Rob Vincennes, and as I said, Peter Rains and myself.
Were you with Peter, or was he on a separate line?
No, I was sitting beside him.
And can you tell the court what was discussed in that teleconference that you participated in?
The discussion was about the proposed burn that would start the next day at the corner of Mount Wilson Road and Bell's Line of Road.
And can you tell the court what suggestions in respect of that plan you contributed and or your brother contributed during the teleconference?
Yeah, so we asked, I asked if we could have the ignition point up on Mount Wilson instead of the corner of Mount Wilson Road and Bell's Line of Road.
Why did you ask?
Because that's the highest point around. It's the highest point around, and also the mountain would then act as a buffer. So Mount Wilson's generally basalt capped. It's got lots of garden. It's a bit greener and lusher than the dry sclerophyll that surrounds it. Peter also asked if we could have the briefing at Mount Wilson instead of at Bilpin. And his reasoning for that was that the out of area crews would then have to drive up onto Mount Wilson, and so we'd get an idea of the lay of the land and the assets that they were ultimately protecting.
Firstly, with respect to the location of the backburn or the anchor point that you suggested, was that to Fours Rocks Road that you suggested?
Correct.
And what was the response of the other participants in the conference to your suggestion?
It seemed it had already been decided that the corner of Mount Wilson Road and Bell's Line of Road would be the anchor point.
did you understand that the choice of the anchor point was due to some rainfall that had recently fallen that would have made your proposed anchor point less effective in implementing a burn in a timely way?
We'd had, Mount Irvine had more rain than what Mount Wilson had. We'd had very little. It would have not hampered a backburn at all.
I understand you might have been recorded as saying in that meeting, Tootie had 6 mil rain start at Mount Wilson at Falls Rocks Road if we are to start at Bell's Line of Road. Is that something that you said in the meeting?
Sorry, that question's not clear.
Did you make a contribution to the meeting which might have been recorded as Tootie had 6 mil rain start at Mount Wilson at Falls Rocks Road if we are to start at Bell's Line of Road?
That doesn't sound clear again. I'm not sure what you're referring to. I can't recall that.
That's all right. Did you or the INT say they had concerns that if the burn was implemented from DeForest Rocks Road or at Mount Wilson, that it might have been a patchy burn?
I can't recall that either.
And finally, do you recall why those at the INT nominated or decided upon the anchor point at Bell's Line of Road and Mount Wilson Road rather than your suggested anchor point?
I can't recall why that decision was made.
And similarly, with respect to your brother's suggestion that the briefing be at Mount Wilson, do you know why, or did the INT say why they preferred the briefing be at Bilpin Memorial Hall?
I believe it was because of outer area crews coming up. They could stage there.
The out of area crews were coming broadly from Sydney, from different areas of northern Sydney. Is that correct?
As far as I understand, yep.
Was there a concern expressed at the INT that logistically it would take too long to get all the appliances up to Mount Wilson and then back down to the anchor point to implement the backburn in a timely way?
There was, but you lost that advantage of local knowledge.
Did you share any other concerns or suggestions with respect to the proposed backburn during that teleconference?
I expressed concerns about the potential for it to jump over Mount Wilson Road into the Bowens Creek area. Once it was in there, as far as I was concerned, it would be uncontainable and would then cross Bell's Line of Road and end up into the Gross Valley.
Did you express any concerns about the level of resourcing? Too much, too little, or not balanced right?
I said that we didn't want too many resources because of the tendency, if you have too many, they put too much fire on the ground and you can't actually manage if you have too many resources. You have to be able to, to cope with how much fire you put on the ground. I was also worried that there was an uneven split between one sector and another, and that one sector would get ahead of the other sector.
And which sector would get ahead? Which one were you concerned about?
I was concerned because Mount Wilson Road, the beginning of Mount Wilson Road has got a number of sharp turns and gully lines running off it that act as natural draws. So it has to be taken fairly slowly, that first section, whereas Bell's Line of Road is that first couple of 100 metres is just a straight run, very easy light up.
What is a natural draw?
It's just a gully where wind will affect any fire behaviour. So the wind may run back up that gully and the potential for spotting is really high.
Did you make any written notes at the time of the conference about your concerns or about the meeting more generally?
Well, I had scrawled notes, nothing that I would rely on.
And at the end of that teleconference, did you consider that all participants were given the opportunity to raise any concerns about the backburn?
Coming out of that teleconference, both my brother and I felt that decisions had already been made before that teleconference took place, and we were told what to do as opposed to having meaningful input into how that backburn would be conducted.
You may have just answered this question, but just for completeness, by the end of the meeting, did you consider that a consensus was reached by the participants at the conference in respect of the backburn?
We accepted that the plan had to be done, but I don't believe we were really given a choice about undertaking it.
Similarly, did Ms Hodges or anyone from the INT specifically and individually ask you whether you agreed to the backburn plan towards the end of the meeting?
If it was because it had to go ahead anyway, like it was a foregone conclusion.
Did the meeting end about 5:40 p.m, about an hour after you were dialed in?
That sounds about right.
Were there any other strategies that could have been deployed other than the backburn at that time?
Waiting, just waiting to see whether those trigger points were met. The other option would be to do other forms of backburning around Mount Wilson or Mount Irvine. So potentially starting where it was dry. If it wasn't going to start at Mount Irvine, then potentially start somewhere between and take it back around Mount Irvine towards Mount Tootie. That had its own risks in the fact that Mount Tootie was still exposed.
Do you recall the weather forecast in the coming days and how that was relevant to the implementation of any backburns?
So we were told on that phone hookup that there was a favourable weather window, and the bad weather was coming at the end of that next week. That was why they wanted to implement this backburn. Given
that information, did you think it was a good idea to make use of that opportunity and start the backburn sooner rather than later, or did you have a different view?
Our view was still to hold, because the fire hadn't crossed into the 2013 fuel loads of the State Mine Fire. We didn't know what was going to happen when it hit those potentially reduced fuel loads.
And when you say our view, is that you and Peter Rains, or you and your brigade?
That was me and my brother, but also it was the consensus of the brigade.
Summarising it then, as at the 13th of December 2019, you had concerns as to the backburn to be implemented the next day, both as to its timing being unnecessarily early and as to its location being unnecessarily dangerous given its proximity to Bowens Creek Basin and eventually uphill to Mount Wilson.
Yeah, it also left Mount Tomah very exposed. And if a fire gets in the Gross, that's bad for any communities to the further east. That was my worry.
Moving then to the 14th of December 2019, the day of the backburn, What was your assigned role on that day?
So I was put in charge of the sector of Mount Wilson Road, which was called October Sector. I had a one-strike team, which was local crews made up of Mount Wilson, Mount Irvine Brigade, Mount Tomar Brigade and Bell Brigade.
Did you know whether there was any reason that local crews were assigned to that particular sector?
I'd specifically asked for local crews.
And why did you ask for local crews for that particular sector?
Because they were familiar with the environment they'll be working in.
And you
I
considered...
also knew their capabilities.
And you considered the Mount Wilson or October sector was essentially trickier than the Dalpura Bells Line of Road sector due to those corners and gullies at the start of the backburn, is that right?
Correct.
Who else had responsibility for the backburn on the 14th of December 2019 and what were their roles?
So Jamie Carter was the divisional commander, and Greg Honeysett was the Dalpura sector, which was the Bells Line of Road sector.
What time?
And,
yes, go on.
sorry, and his name escapes me at the moment. Craig Burley was the safety officer.
Mr. Burley, and he was he also the Bell Operations Officer?
I was only aware that he was the safety officer.
Do you recall if Mr. Burley was present during the 13th of December conference?
Sorry, we couldn't hear that answer, Ms. Rains.
I can't recall if he was on that phone hookup.
Then on the 14th of December 2019, what time did the backburn commence?
Just shy of 10 a.m.
Did your team implement line or spot ignition?
Spot ignition. So the instruction I had was spot ignition, and crews only light up what a hose length they could cope with, and monitor the spots until they joined and got sufficient depth in until they were able to move on and leapfrog each other.
And in that initial part of the backburn in October sector, how did your sector go with implementing the backburn?
Well, slow because of the caution through all those corners until it started straightening out. So the first hour and a half, 2 hours was slow.
When did things first seem to be not going quite right in your estimation, and what prompted you to think that?
On the ground, everything looked fine from my point of view on Mount Wilson Road, but the air attack, Chris Banffy got on the radio, it's around about midday, I think, to say that the Bells Line of Road, Dalpura sector, he was worried that that had got ahead of the Mount Wilson Road sector.
I'll bring up page 4011 of the Gross Valley Brief. Hopefully it'll come up on your screen. For those following, it's tab 91 being Mr. Carter's transcribed logbook, volume 13. Ms. Rains, can you see the logbook up on your screen?
I can, but I can't see detail.
All right, is it too pixelated for you to read it?
It's okay. Yep.
Is that now legible?
Yes.
All right. Well, just going through this so we can understand the timing. Starting at 1100 at the top of the screen, Oct SL, that's October sector leader. So does that refer to your role as at that time?
Yes, it does.
All right. And the entry there says, don't want to be outflanked by Dalpura. Were you there expressing a general aim that you wanted to keep your end of the backburn up rather than having any particular concerns about being outflanked as early as 11 a.m?
If that's what's written there, I was worried that Dalpura would get ahead of October sector and we would be outflanked.
All
And
right,
then Dalpura sector could
And,
have the potential to run and cross Mount Wilson Road before we'd got our backburn to that point.
Turning then just to 1109, and it's the entry by Air Attack E or Air Attack Supervisor East, which we understand to be Mr. Burley. You see that first entry at 1109? Banfi, sorry.
Yes.
That's at 1109. Was that when you first became concerned, or do you say that the message from Mr. Banfi was later in the day that caused you to have some concerns?
No, that would have been about right.
And then you can see at 1112, can't you, October sector leader, something in response to those communications from the air attack?
That's correct.
And that entry about hearing the air attack message reflected your understanding at the time?
Yes. So we were going as fast as I was prepared to go. So we still had control of that backburn. But as I said, I was worried that because of the easy light up of Dalpura sector, that they had got further distance-wise than what we had got.
All right. I'll just keep that image up there as I'm going to go through it. But in your statement at paragraph 16, you said there that you had a minor spot on the side of the road that we dealt with. However, that was the only spot over we had and was less than a metre square. In your statement, you said that was after you first realised something wasn't going quite right. That spotting that you were talking of then was I'll withdraw that. Looking then at 1139 on screen, the AAE entry, there's a mention of spotting. It doesn't have much detail, but the 1 metre spot that was contained, was that at around 1139 or a bit earlier or later, or you can't remember?
I can't recall.
All right, but it wasn't of concern at that time, that spot that was dealt with, is that correct?
That's correct. It was reported to me that there was just one spot. It was quickly extinguished and it was small.
All right. Do you know whether it was on the eastern side of Mount Wilson Road or was it within the containment area?
No, I was on the eastern side of Mount Wilson Road. It was quickly spotted and quickly.
All right. Just going down then, while that's still on screen, to 1159, which might be the next page. Actually, no. Down the bottom of the page, 1159. There's an entry from the October sector leader. Is there anything you wish to say in respect of that entry to clarify or add to?
I think when I said fire quite volatile, settles down, that would be just in relation to as the wind blew. So as the wind picked up a bit, as in just a slight gust, the fire would increase, and then it would settle down again.
Do you have any recollection of what the wind direction was like at around 11:59?
It was variable. So sometimes we had the smoke blowing back over the road, and other times it was clear. It was light. There wasn't anything to be, I didn't feel there was anything to be concerned about with the wind at that time.
All right, so between 10 to 12 o'clock, you didn't have any particular concerns with how the backburn was progressing at that time, is that right?
No, just apart from the two sectors progressing at the same rate to get the same depth in. So one didn't outflank the other.
Yes. Just going then to the next page while it's still on screen. And down to 12:29, there's an entry for October sector leader. Do you see that?
Yep.
And what can you tell the court about your thoughts and what you were thinking at the time of that entry?
So again, smoke blowing over the road, line burning in nicely. So again, things were going well.
And smoke blowing over the road, so what direction do you think that was describing?
It depended a bit where I was at the time. So it could have been it could have just been a gust that just came from another direction, or a lull that then the smoke came over. I can't answer with any specifics about that.
That's all right. Do you have any specific recollection about 12:29, how the weather was at that time, or not specifically?
Not specifically.
We'll jump forward then ahead 1 hour, still on this document, to 13:59. I actually withdraw that. Just at 1300, which is on screen, again an entry from October sector leader. Can you see that?
Yep.
And particularly the last three lines of the entry attributed to you, what do those entries tell us?
So temperature 27, RH of 23, and winds southwest 3 to 7.5. So the wind had swung around.
All right, so you're saying had the wind swung to a west-southwest or from west to southwest, or what do those letters tell us?
So the winds are from the southwest, 3 up to 7.5 kilometres per hour.
And was that?
So I think the predicted winds were from the southeast, and no, they weren't in our favour. So that would have been pushing smoke over the road. But the winds were still light at that stage.
Right, and those entries, were they based on any measurements you took, or were they your estimation, or did someone else tell you?
Yeah, I object, Your
No,
Just one moment, sorry.
They're not Ms. Rain's entries, so it's complete speculation. It records a message, but we don't know that she was taking temperature at all. It's a scribe making a note about weather. We know Mr. Carter was taking weather readings as well. So the whole question was prefaced on an assumption, which in my respectful submission hasn't been made.
Oh, I think probably go back one step and ask who was taking the readings, if known.
Yes, Your Honour, I will. If that entry could please be brought up again. Ms. Rains, this isn't a document that you prepared. We understand it's Mr. Carter's logbook and it's being transcribed, and the person who made the entries was, in fact, we understand, a scribe on Mr. Carter's behalf. So do you understand the background of the document that's now being shown to you?
Yes, I do.
All right. And did you take those measurements that are shown? Are they attributed to you, or you don't know how those measurements have come to be recorded at that time in that logbook?
I can't actually recall taking weather measurements, but if they're logged, there's an assumption I would have. And I would have done it with a Kestrel. I just can't recall, sorry.
That's okay. You don't remember using a Kestrel or not back on the 14th of December 2019, do you?
I can't recall either way. I would have had one with me in the vehicle, and if I was asked to do a weather, I would have done a weather.
All right. Looking then at 1359, withdraw that. Just go over to the next page, please. Can you see at 1403, there's an entry under the call sign, October North?
Yep.
All right, that image can be taken down. What was the significance between October North and South on that day in terms of the sectors?
So at some point, another anchor point had to be established up on top of Mount Wilson to start another burn to bring the fire down off Mount Wilson to join up to the back burn that was being conducted on Mount Wilson Road.
And do you know what time crews went up to Mount Wilson for that purpose?
So I think, again, I'd have to refer to my notes. We left around about 2 p.m.
Did you say in your statement, particularly around paragraph 17, that you were concerned there wasn't a plan in place to get the Mount Wilson burn up into Mount Wilson itself?
That's correct. There was no plan. It hadn't been, it wasn't in the IAP, and it was obvious to me that fire had to be brought down off Mount Wilson to join on to that back burn. There's no way you could have taken what was lit on Mount Wilson Road and continue it up onto Mount Wilson.
So do you say by as late as 2 p.m. on the 14th of December 2019, you understood there was no plan to have a backburn at Mount Wilson Village to be brought down to the existing Mount Wilson backburn near Bell's Line of Road?
So I suggested it to the DivCom that I would have to leave and take a strike team with me to start lighting up at Mount Wilson to bring it back down off Mount Wilson onto Bell's Line of Road.
When do you say you made that suggestion?
It was between 1 and 2 p.m.
And do you say that that was essentially your idea and it wasn't something planned by DivCom or in the IAP?
The idea was, that was why we brought it up the day before at the planning, was to start up on Mount Wilson at DeForest Rocks, was because of that reason.
Just in fairness to you, so that we can...
It wasn't a new concept, but it was not in the plan per se.
Just in fairness to you, we might bring up a plan that touches upon that. Page 4064 of the brief, which is Mr. Carter's statement still behind tab 91 of volume 13, annexure E but then down at page, as I said, 4064, that might not be very clear to you, but is there a document up on screen, Ms. Rains?
There is, again, I can't read it.
That's right. We might zoom into the top left corner just to orient you to it so that you can follow. Let us know if you can read the text.
Yeah, just go one closer, please. Yep.
So you can see that Bilpin Division sub-plan operational period 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. on the 14th of December 2019.
Yep.
And if we just scroll down still on this side of the page, we're down to under execution and further down, particularly Mount Wilson and October sector. In that middle column, doesn't that provide for a separate backburn under October sector from southward from Defore's track?
The problem with that is the October sector north was Peter Rains, and he was to do night shift. So he wasn't available to start that October sector north.
I can have the image taken down, but do you accept that there was on paper under that sub-plan of the IOP at least some plan in respect of Defore's Rocks Road as well as the Bells Line of Road, Mount Wilson Road backburn?
There was the idea that it had to be done. There was, as far as I was concerned, when I say plan, the execution of that plan was lacking.
Was the reason as you understood it, that the backburn from Mount Wilson Village was delayed due to allowing the fuels up there to be drier later in the day than they would have been if a burn had commenced at 10 in the morning?
There was no problem with the dryness of the fuels up at Mount Wilson.
And how did you know that?
Sorry, we missed that. There was something wrong with.
We hadn't got the rain that Mount Irvine had got.
Does it accord with your memory that it was 2 to 2.5 millilitres rain up near Mount Wilson around that time? We didn't hear the answer, sorry, it might have cut out.
On the 11th, that's when the rain was. That 2.5 would have 14th.
Oh, we're having a few problems with the connection. I'm sorry, Ms. Rains.
We heard your answer where you said there was that 2 to 2.5 millilitres rain was on the 11th. What did you say after that?
Any advantage of that rain or disadvantage of that rain would have gone by the 14th.
Was that a view that you expressed during the 13th of December 2019 teleconference?
I can't recall any comment about fuel moistures on Mount Wilson during that phone hookup. There were concerns about fuel moistures at Mount Irvine, but that's 10 kilometres further to the east.
So around 2 p.m, you headed up to Mount Wilson Village. Who did you take with you up there?
So before we left, another strike team had come in from Sydney area, and I got them to slot in on Mount Wilson Road with the view that they would take over the Mount Wilson Road back burning operations under the supervision of the Mount Tomar captain, and I would take the local crews who I had in my strike team up onto Mount Wilson with the idea of starting an anchor point on the Force Rocks Road to bring the fire down off Mount Wilson onto Mount Wilson Road.
Was the out of area Sydney strike team perhaps from the hills?
That's likely. I couldn't remember if it was the hills.
And who do you say you left in charge of the out of area strike team when you went up to Mount Wilson Village?
Mount Tomar captain Peter Ellison.
So was it the case that Mr. Ellison was in charge of the out of area crews in the October South sector, or was he filling the gap until the out of area crews started lighting up and then they would become the October South sector leader?
The incoming crews were already in position before we pulled out. Peter Ellison was already in, I had handed over in the field to him. The crews had already set up with the spacing that we had had originally, with the instruction that they would just light up what they could manage with their hoses before and after a vehicle. So there was always a hose length between the vehicles that they could manage whatever fire was being put on the ground.
In addition to that, was there any briefing that you yourself gave to the out of area crews before leaving and heading up to Mount Wilson Village?
I gave them those same instructions, that they would always have the length of hose behind them and in front of them, and only light up what they could manage, wait for it to get in with sufficient depth, and then move on.
When you and your crew left for Mount Wilson Village, what was your impression of how well controlled the backburn was at that time?
When we left, and we have photos of that when we left, there are crews spread out with hose lengths in place. Spot ignition was occurring, and all was going well. The flame height was 1/2 metre to 1 metre, and the crews were doing as instructed.
And did you say in your statement, paragraph 18, that you would never have left if there was anything of concern?
That's correct.
After you headed to Mount Wilson Village, did your crew have a break before progressing to implement the next stage of the backburn?
That's correct. We stopped at Mount Wilson Fire Station for comfort breaks.
When did you then hear that things were not going well with the backburn?
It was around about 2:30, and the radio chatter was that fire activity had picked up.
I'll have brought up, please, Mr. Carter's transcribed logbook again from page 4013. And if we can zoom into about down the page, 1442. Ms. Rains, can you see 1442, an operation, an entry from Bell Ops about a spot over?
Yep. So that.
was that some of the early radio chatter talking about the issues with the backburn around 2:30 that you were describing?
Yes.
Just going then to the next page. And stopping there. Can you see the entries at 1446 and 1451?
Yep.
All right. And have you read the details of the event and message for those? If that can then be taken down, that document. After you heard this chatter on the radio about problems with the backburn, what did you understand was happening at that time?
That they'd lost control of the backburn.
Do you remember from where you were in Mount Wilson Village how the weather was around that time or wind direction?
I remember the weather. The wind had changed, so it picked up. I hadn't noticed probably the change in the wind direction, but the wind strength had definitely picked up.
After that time, what steps, if any, did you take in respect of alerting the local community to any concerns that you had?
So at the station, we had our community engagement officer. I spoke to him, and as soon as we knew that there were spots over Mount Wilson Road that couldn't be contained, I got him to send out an email to all our community to say that the fire fire activity would escalate and the southern parts of Mount Wilson would be under threat.
Firstly, did you have the community engagement person send the email at about 3:12 p.m?
Something like that.
And who was the community engagement person?
Richard Beattie.
Do you recall what his role description was in that respect?
So in our brigade, we've set up a system where the community engagement officer has a number of people within Mount Wilson and Mount Irvine in specific areas that he can call on, who then have oversight on all those. So the streets are split up. There is a street coordinator for each area, and they have communication with everyone in their street. So we can get communication from the brigade or for whatever through the community engagement officer, through to the street coordinators, through to every resident, either if they're on the mountain or off.
Yes. Is that an arrangement which is unique to the Mount Wilson, Mount Irvine Brigade, or is it part of a broader RFS policy, to your knowledge?
It's something we as a brigade have worked on. I'm sure there's other brigades who do something similar, but it's something that we've developed and works incredibly well for us.
Do you know if at that time, the 14th of December 2019, under your community engagement arrangement, every known occupied household in Mount Wilson and Mount Irvine, would it be reachable, or was it not that precise?
It was, no, they were reachable. So we had, in preparation for this, we had a laminated sheet on every property describing the hazards on that property, the location of those hazards, water sources, water pumps, how to access that, anything a firefighter would need to help defend that property.
And under this community engagement arrangement, was there a means of checking whether emails were successfully sent through to each resident?
Yeah, so we've got a system where the street coordinator contacts by phone every resident and finds out their location, whether they're on the mountain or off the mountain, and their intention. So, and that gets updated daily. So if their intention is to leave, then that's captured. Or if they, if they're off the mountain and staying off the mountain, that's captured as well. So people who aren't available by email are contacted either by phone or in person.
Yes. So do I understand from your answer that the main means of communication under that arrangement is firstly email, but if known not to have email, an individual phone call, and then if an individual phone call is unavailable or unsuccessful, it's a door knock?
That's correct.
Do you have any specific recollection about whether people and how many people in the community were given phone calls or door knocks at that time on the 14th of December? Was your answer no?
I said I don't know.
Don't know.
I'm not aware of the specifics of what each street coordinator did and the results.
And how many residents are included in this arrangement or campaign in Mount Wilson, Mount Irvine?
Every landholder that we know of.
And can you give an estimate?
There was a few that were missed out. A property had changed hands that we weren't aware of, and we didn't have those property owners' details. Number-wise, there's roughly around about 300 residents for Mount Wilson and Mount Irvine, and they're the only two communities I'm talking about, Mount Wilson and Mount Irvine.
And how many were of the category that you didn't have contact details for?
Less than 1%.
Sorry, what was that answer? Missed that.
Less than 1%.
Thank you. In terms of that arrangement, last question on this, was there any record of the campaign that will be kept other than the inherent in the sending of the emails?
Sorry, could you rephrase that?
The arrangement in terms of your community engagement, was that recorded in any way on the 14th of December?
Just via emails were sent. They would have been kept.
Right. Well, after the backburn was lost as you understood it, what steps did you and your brigade take?
So as soon as things weren't going to plan, there was no way that I was going to implement the backburn onto Fours Rocks Road off Mount Wilson. Instead, I redeployed that strike team to the properties along Mount Wilson Road and Winds Rocks Road.
And in summary, what firefighting efforts did your and assisting brigades take around Mount Wilson and Mount Irvine for the rest of that day?
They were in property protection on the two properties on Mount Wilson Road and the properties on the southern end of Winds Rocks Road. They were doing property protection.
Was the two properties on Mount Wilson Road on the western side of the road?
Was that yes? Sorry, it just broke up.
Sorry, yes.
And how was the brigade successful in terms of property protection on that first afternoon and evening of the 14th of December?
That's correct. There would have been fence losses and garden losses. I wasn't aware of any structure losses in the form of garden sheds or outbuildings. There were no house losses.
And moving into the evening, what type of further protective measures did your brigade or those assisting put in ahead of the following day?
We did last minute backburning between the bottom of a cleared property and the incoming fire, just to take that bit of unburnt bush out that was on the western side of Winsrocks Road, on the southern end of it. There is a trail that goes about halfway along there. It was just to tie the fire back in onto that trail and off the bottom of those properties.
And was it a case that, unfortunately, properties were impacted the following day, including your own, and indeed in the days that followed in your and surrounding communities?
That was a yes, was it, Ms Rains?
Yes, it was. Yeah.
In terms of, I withdraw that. Is it the case that, as at say 13th of December 2019, did you then support a strategic backburn being implemented to protect Mount Wilson and Mount Irvine within that mid-December 2019 period of anticipated favourable weather before the weather got worse?
So extensive preparations had been carried out for a backburn to take place.
Looking back at the events of 13, 14 December and after that, do you say, in your view, anything should have been done differently by those with responsibility for implementing backburns and planning them?
Up to mid that week, so the 12th, around about the 12th of December, there was a clearly established plan and that we had communicated to the brigade and to the community that would be backburning, the potential for backburning once trigger points were met from Bilpin to Mount Irvine to Mount Wilson and then back out to Bell. That changed right at the end of that week. And from our point of view, we weren't consulted we weren't able to have robust discussions about the start point of that backburn. Our view was always to bring it from Mount Irvine, once conditions allowed for us to do that, to Mount Wilson and then out to Bell's Line of Road and Bell.
So it's your view that the backburn started unnecessarily early and in an unfavourable location compared with other options. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. We, as in my brother, sent an email on the 12th of December, suggesting hold points around Mount Irvine and Mount Wilson, and saying that we weren't in any hurry to start the backburn.
Just in respect of paragraph 31 of your statement, can you read that silently to yourself first? Have you now read that?
Yep.
What did you mean in the second sentence, starting with the word however, who is to say?
Because it would take time for whatever fire we started, if we started at Mount Wilson or Mount Irvine, to reach on to Mount Wilson Road, which is where I saw the vulnerability. That we didn't know what the weather was going to do by that stage. So when I say, who's to say that the other side of Bells Liner Road still wouldn't have taken off? I'm meaning that the potential for the backburn when it reached that area to spot over was still high, depending on what the weather conditions were at the time. You know, whether that would have been 4 days later, 5 days, 6 days later from when the backburn started.
Towards the end of your statement, you made a number of observations about some problems in terms of aerial support, maintenance of roads, implementations of hazard reduction. You recall those observations?
Yep.
Is there anything else you wish to add for the court to consider before you conclude this part of your evidence?
It's really hard for brigades like Mount Wilson, Mount Irvine, Bell and Mount Tomah, who generally work under Blue Mountains District, to then be handed over to an outside district, fire district, because we lose the support that we're used to. So, for example, I know Karen Hodges at Hawkesbury. I know a number of the group officers' names at Hawkesbury, but I don't know all of them. I don't have any contact details for any of them. I don't know who are good strategic thinkers. I know some of them through work relationships. I know some of them through word of mouth, but we don't have those relationships that we do with our Blue Mountains group officers. So to talk and plan, we just don't have those relationships. It was something that was highlighted in 2013 after the State Mine Fire. And the problem with Mount Wilson, Mount Irvine is we have Chifley District to the west of us and Hawkesbury District to the east of us, and Mount Irvine stuck in the middle. And more could be done to just for pre-incident planning for those cross-jurisdictional brigades who have got high likelihood of being put with another district that's not their own.
Yes. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. Ms. Rains, there may be some other questions now. Mr. James. We'll just go through till 11:30.
Thank you, Your Honour. I'll try to be done by 11:30, but I shouldn't have too many questions.
We'll just take a break at 11:30 just because so Ms. Rains can have a break.
Yes, Your Honour. Ms. Rains, I act on behalf of certain of the affected residents around Mount Wilson. Firstly, can I say thank you for your service on the days. Can I take you to paragraph 8 of your statement? I withdraw that. Paragraph 7 of your statement. You were asked, I understand, by the IMT to coordinate the fire trail preparation work around Mount Wilson, Mount Irvine and Bell. You gave some evidence earlier that at the end of November you'd started to prepare the fire trails around that area. Was there a particular order in which you were coordinating those works?
It depended on the machinery available and its location. I can't remember exact details of where it was at the time. I believe I had some starting at Bell first because they were closer in proximity to Bell.
Was there any consideration about where the back-burning operations would be undertaken in relation to where you might have been clearing those trails?
So the back-burning was planned to go from Bilpin, across Bowens Creek Road, Mount Irvine Road at that stage, at the Bilpin side, to Bowens Creek Road, around Mount Irvine, through to Mount Wilson, and then out to Bell.
And as I understand it, there had been some back-burning that had proceeded from the east up until about the 11th of December, is that correct?
That's correct. It got as far as I think the east side of Mount Tootie.
And have there been preparation for the back-burning to continue beyond Mount Tootie, at least up to 11th of December?
That's right. So we had cut, when I say we, a hand tool line had been cut from Mount Irvine Road on the Bilpin side, crossing Bowens Creek, and another hand tool line off Bowens Creek Road, joining up. And the idea that they'd be back burning off that hand tool line. Our side, we'd put hose line along that stretch and a buoy wall. Buoy wall was full, the hose line was laid out, it was ready to go.
And what preparation had been done in and around the area of the Bells Line of Road and Mount Wilson Road by about the 11th of December for any back-burning operations to commence?
So fire trails around Mount Wilson and Mount Irvine had been done, but nothing had been done on the east side of Mount Wilson Road.
On the 13th of December, if I can take you to the telephone hookup that you had previously discussed, you mentioned that there were a number of participants. If I've got them down, you named Karen Hodges, James Carter, at least Rob Vincennes, yourself and your brother and deputy Peter Rains, is that correct? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that answer. Yes. Do you recall if there were any other persons that were involved in that call, either from the Hawkesbury IMT as on behalf of the Rural Firefighting Service or from National Parks at all?
I can't recall.
And during that meeting, I understand from your evidence, this was where there was a discussion that you heard for the first time that there was going to be a backburn to commence at the Bells Line of Road and Mount Wilson Road that following day. You say at paragraph 11 of your statement that you had little time, and paraphrasing the first sentence, to organise crews due to the late notice you received. What type of timing would you expect to receive for instruction to be ready to conduct a backburning of this nature?
We had to start organising and splitting our crews into day shift and night shift. We had a lot of our members have lived predominantly in Sydney, so they had to relocate if they were going to come up and help.
So prior to that meeting on the 13th, is it the case that you had not yet split the crews into a day shift and night shift?
No, up until the 13th and including the 13th, we still had crews out doing plant support and final preparations.
And I understand you said earlier that your brother Peter Rains would be on the night shift following that meeting. Is that correct?
That's correct. So he'd be the night shift of after the 14th.
During the course of the meeting, you've given some evidence of some matters that you raised regarding a alternative starting point in the vicinity of Defoe's Rocks Road. Had the backburn commenced in that location, would it have been necessary to have had the burn conducted in the same way? That is, one burn from planned from the top of the hill down, and actually I withdraw that, I'll start that again. When you had suggested the burn from Defoe's Rocks Road, how did you envisage the backburn would proceed at that time?
So there'd be a strike team taking one part of the fire around Mount Wilson to the northeast, and one around off Defoe's Rocks Road down towards Bell's Line of Mount Wilson Road to the southwest.
Now, as matters proceeded, there was a anchor point at the corner of Bell's Line of Road and Mount Wilson Road, and you've given evidence that at least at some point on the 14th, you had proceeded up Mount Wilson to create a new anchor point to come down towards where that burn had started. If the burn had commenced at Defoe's Rocks Road, would there have been any need to create a second anchor point at another location in the same manner that you had identified on the day of the 14th?
Depending on weather conditions, by the time you got near the vicinity of the junction of Mount Wilson Road and Bell's Line of Road, you may have had to put in or commenced a backburn from that corner to take the corner out.
During the course of the meeting on the 13th of December, was any reason given to you for the what you've described as, I believe, a change of plan, that is to commence the backburning on the 14th?
They were worried about fire activity on the Nunes Plateau, which is further to the northwest of us.
And as I understand it, the previous plan, if I can refer to it that way, had been to backburn heading west from Bilpin. So how would this change, or how was it expressed to you that this change related to the fire activity on the Nunes Plateau?
So because of the fire activity at Nunes Plateau and the proximity of assets around Dargan and Bell, they were worried that they would have to start backburning there. And if they did that, that the fire and the predicted weather that was coming later in the week would make Mount Wilson, Mount Irvine vulnerable.
And forgive me, is that area is, as far as the Gross Mountain fire was concerned, was that a particularly westerly or particularly easterly section of the front?
That was to the west.
And was that the only reason that was given to you as to why there was going to be this change of plan?
As far as I
Now, you gave evidence earlier that there were other options that at least you had, or that you now consider were options. I think one of them was to hold pending the trigger points. Forgive me, I'm just finding my note. Had those, did your opinion change when you were informed of the reasons for the change of plan at that meeting?
I could understand the need for a backburn. Our problem was more the location of where they started it.
And when you say the location, you mean specifically the corner of Bell's Line of Road and Mount Wilson Road, rather than DeForest Rocks Road as an example. Is that correct? Were there any other concerns that you had in relation to the timing of the backburn?
Not that I can recall.
Was the practice in and around Mount Wilson to conduct backburns at any particular time of day prior to this?
Our preference is to do backburning at night. It's easier to manage, and sometimes you can cover more ground at night and then just hold what you've lit during the day.
Do you recall whether that was
You can
mentioned?
have.
My apologies. I'm sorry,
I can't recall. Sorry.
Your Honour, I note the time. If I might have the break to gather my thoughts, I might only have a couple of further questions.
Certainly. We'll take the morning adjournment, Ms Rains, so we'll come back at 12 o'clock. please, Mr James.
May it please, Your Honour. I only expect to be about 2 or 3 more minutes.
Sure.
Ms Rains, if I can take you to the events of the afternoon of the 14th of December, and perhaps a starting point might be that I understand from your statement at paragraph 18, you had left the area of the backburning along Mount Wilson Road for Mount Wilson at around 2 p.m. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And after that, you've given evidence that you attended the station and had a short comfort break. Is that correct?
That's correct.
After you started to get or to hear the on the radio that things were not proceeding well on Mount Wilson Road, and that the spots had arisen on the eastern side of Mount Wilson Road, I understand you redeployed almost all of the assets to Winds Rocks Road and that area. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that was moving into a property protection footing at that time. Is that right?
Yeah.
There was an additional crew member with you that you sent to a different location, a Mr. Keith Waters. Where did you ask him to go?
I asked him to return to his home, which is at the bottom of Mount Wilson, on Mount Wilson Road. There's two houses technically off the mountain at the base of Mount Wilson on the western side of Mount Wilson Road.
And so by the western side, the opposite side to Winds Rocks Road. So it must have been some distance away.
Direct line, maybe 1.5 kilometres by road, probably 2 kilometres.
And you yourself, I understand, that afternoon were in the vicinity of Winds Rocks Road for most of that afternoon. Is that correct?
Yes.
So did you hear from Mr. Waters again that afternoon as to the status of the area to the west of Mount Wilson Road?
I can't recall hearing from him directly until probably that evening.
Did you say that evening?
Mm.
And
So he had a fire truck with him and another truck. I can't recall which truck he had with him, and the other house had another fire truck with it.
And when you heard from him that evening, did he tell you anything about how the fire had progressed on the western side of Mount Wilson Road?
He said that they'd been impacted by fire, both those properties.
And does that say anything to you about how the fire had progressed on that side of the road for him to be impacted by fire?
I'm not sure whether they got impacted. The Dalpura sector taking a run, or whether it was the spotting back over Mount Wilson Road. It was a result of the backburn, either way.
And in the coming days, did you become aware of what had occurred in respect of the area to the west of Mount Wilson Road as to the progression of the fire on that side of the road?
By that stage, fire was on both sides of the road and was engulfing both sides of Mount Wilson.
And when you say engulfing, am I right in explaining the geography of the western side of Mount Wilson? There was a relatively steep hillside to the south of Defers Rocks Road, which is where you had previously mentioned you were suggesting the backburn begin.
Wilson's got steep slopes on all sides, and by days in, we had property protection around the majority of Mount Wilson.
So including
to the
that
north,
west.
to the west, to the east. Yep.
Were any properties impacted to the west of Mount Wilson in those coming days, so the 14th, the 15th or the 16th of December?
So the properties off Mount Wilson, so the two properties were impacted on the 14th.
Yes.
And then properties along Mount Wilson Road, the Avenue, Church Lane, Windsrocks Road, Queen's Avenue were all affected on the 14th, 15th, 16th.
And where is
beyond?
Pardon me. Where is the station in by reference to DeFoes Rocks Road?
It's at the top of DeFoes Rocks Road, on the corner of DeFoes Rocks and the Avenue.
And was that under any threat by the western side of the fire at this point?
Yes, it came. I'm not sure whether it was on the 14th or 15th. There was retardant drops done around the station, and that was, we had crews doing property protection around the hall, the fire station and the old school.
And was that from the, or are you able to say what aspect of the fire was threatening the station at that point?
It would have been a flank of the backburn.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you. Ms Avery Williams.
Nothing from me, Your Honour.
Mr Newton.
Yes, Your Honour. Ms Rains, can you see and hear me? I just want to ask you firstly some questions about your evidence of the difficulties that your brigades face as being essentially, as I understand it, the intersection of Lithgow Rural Fire District, Blue Mountains Rural Fire District and Hawkesbury Rural Fire District. Do you understand what I'm talking about? Now, you were involved relatively early in planning for the southern containment line. From around about the 10th of November, or does that sound about right?
It wasn't from the 10th of November. It would have been from the end of November.
I see.
Sorry. You're talking about active firefighting on the southern containment of Gospers Mountain, are you?
No, I'm talking about when you started becoming involved in thinking about the southern containment line and the preparation of fire trails around Mount Wilson and Mount Irvine and that type of area.
That was at the end of November.
I see. But as part of that, is it right that you had discussions with Mr. Carter and Mr. Vincennes, amongst other people?
Yes. Yeah, and that's when the trigger point. That's when the trigger point plan was formulated.
And you understood Mr. Carter was a group officer within the Blue Mountains Rural Fire District?
Yes.
And Mr. Vincennes was the fire control officer at the Blue Mountains Rural Fire District?
Yes.
Whilst well, I withdraw that. And one of the reasons for the problem your brigade has is that it's at the northern end of the Blue Mountains Rural Fire District, but it gets affected by fires to its north, amongst other areas, which tend to come either from the Lithgow Rural Fire District or the Hawkesbury Rural Fire District. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so it's almost inevitable that Lithgow and Hawkesbury are going to have to have some involvement in those fires to the north of Mount Wilson. Is that right?
Yes.
And so your brigades, if I can put it in the position where there needs to be some coordination between the various rural fire districts depending on where a fire is burning relative to Mount Wilson.
Yes.
And were you aware that Mr. Carter was acting as a liaison officer between the Blue Mountains Rural Fire District and the Hawkesbury Rural Fire District?
Yes,
And so part of his role was to address concerns that you'd had, which had arisen at least as early as the state mine fire in October 2013.
yes, I'm not sure if he was aware of the difficulties we had during that fire because he wasn't a group officer at that time.
No, but that, well, I would draw that. Mr. Did you understand, though, that Mr. Vincennes and Mr. Carter had a continuing role in providing input into the planning of the southern containment line up to and including the 13th of December 2019, excuse me?
They were on the phone hookup. I have no idea how much they were involved in the pre-planning of the actual subsequent plan, as opposed to the trigger plan.
But in any event, you mentioned the phone hookup, and by that you're referring to the phone hookup that was in the afternoon of 13 December 2019.
Yes.
In terms of your understanding of how the planning was progressing in terms of that southern containment line area, do you recall that you met with Peter Jones of the Coronial Rural Fire Brigade and an Adrian Johnston of the National Parks and Wildlife Service at the Mount Wilson Brigade Station on the 11th of December 2019?
I don't recall.
There's a statement in the brief of evidence of Mr. Jones where he describes a meeting that you had with him and Mr. I've drawn that. Were you aware that Mr. Jones and Mr. Johnson of the National Parks and Wildlife Service were part of the planning team within the Hawkesbury IMT?
I can't recall that.
This was a fire season where you were involved almost on a daily basis from at least early November 2019, is that correct?
I was involved from the end of October.
And that involved going to other locations. I think you described in your role as a National Parks remote area firefighter, and is that right?
That's correct.
And so is it fair to say that details of individual meetings and what were discussed at individual meetings, you may have forgotten that given the amount of meetings you had and the many activities you were undertaking during that fire season?
It's fair to say.
So that if Mr. Johnson has a record of a meeting that if Mr. Johnson, I would draw that, if Mr. Jones says he had a meeting with you to discuss planning for the southern containment line on the 11th of December 2019, you have no reason to doubt that what he's saying is correct?
When you say the southern containment line, I still am unsure of whether you're talking about the plan for the 13th or whether you're talking about the trigger point plan, which is what we were still working towards.
Well, what Mr. Jones says is that on the 11th of December, he understood the plan was to undertake backburning in and around Mount Wilson and Mount Irvine on the 15th of December 2019. Do you understand what I'm putting to you?
Yeah, so the plan was to, as I said, to work from east to west to get that containment solid from Bilpin, round Mount Tootie, round Mount Irvine, around Mount Wilson, out to Bell.
And that was a plan which they had the planning team within the Hawkesbury AMT had actually identified the 15th of December 2019 as a day where the weather forecast indicated it would be favourable for backburning.
I can't recall those details.
But sitting here now, do you accept that it's possible that you were aware that there was a plan to undertake backburning in the manner which you've just described, namely to the west, which was to take place on the 15th of December 2019?
I can't remember the date. Definitely there was a plan.
And in fact, it was the case, wasn't it, that your brigade and also the Bell Brigade were keen for the backburning to take place as soon as possible?
I said on the 12th, my brother sent an email to Rob Vincennes, amongst others, saying that we should start talking about the potential to burn, but we were in no hurry to start the backburn.
In terms of the
planning of a planning of potential hold points around Mount Irvine until they got the protection in around Mount Tootie.
Okay. As I understand your evidence, you understood the trigger point, the 99th Northing, hadn't been breached at the time that the change of the time the 13 December meeting occurred. Is that right?
That's correct.
But if a line scan shows that the fire was actually on the southern side of the 99th Northing as at 11 December 2019, would you accept that the triggers point, if that assumption's correct, had been breached?
I don't recall that being vocalised.
I'm not asking whether it was vocalised, but if within the brief of evidence there's a line scan which shows fire on the southern side of that 99th Northing on the 11th of December 2019, then that would mean that the trigger point had been breached as at the 11th of December 2019. Do you agree with that?
That's fair.
And then is it right that you had conversations from time to time with members of the Hawkesbury IMT planning by phone?
I can't recall phone calls with Hawkesbury IMT about the location of the Mount Wilson backburn.
But in terms of
prior to the burn.
If there's a record, I'll withdraw that. Just bear with me, Ms. Rains. Sorry, I've got too many folders at the moment. There's a notation within, I'll draw that. Could the witness be shown page 373-10 of the brief, which is behind tab 11?
Oh, which volume?
I don't know the volumes, unfortunately, but it's tab 11.
Thank you. We'll just see if we can get that up on the screen for you, Ms. Rains.
373-10. And just, it's the top entry at 1715, so if they could be made as big as possible, please. Ms. Rain, are you able to read that?
Yeah.
Sorry, you just cut out. Was that yes, or make it bigger, or I'm just not sure what you said?
No, I can read that.
Okay, what you can't see on that is that it's an operational log of a woman named Patricia Back, who we understand was a scribe within the Hawkesbury Incident Management Team, and it's dated the 12th of December 2019. And it appears to be a record of a conversation, it says with Mount Wilson, and that's concerned, and also that the captain of Bell is concerned with the current fire activity, and waiting until Sunday is going to put Bell in a difficult situation. They want to start Mount Irvine through to Bell. So just dealing with that last thing, the Mount Irvine through to Bell was the plan that you understood was going to be undertaken in relation to backburning in the Mount Irvine, Mount Wilson area, is that right?
That's right.
And in terms of the concern, one of the concerns that you understood was exercising people's mind was the threat that was being posed to the Bell, Clarence and Dargan area, is that correct?
That's correct.
And so having looked at, and the other aspect is, if the Sunday was the 15th of December, is that your recollection?
Yep.
Now, having seen this, do you have a recollection now that you were the person at Mount Wilson that might have had the concerns expressed in that note?
I can't recall. I mean, it's written there. I can't recall.
It does suggest, though, that at least the captain of Bell and also a member of the Mount Wilson Brigade was aware that there was a plan to commence backburning on the 15th of December, but that the people involved in this discussion wished to push it forward. Would you agree with that?
They were concerned about Bell being under threat of what's happening at Nunes Plateau.
But that's not, you just don't remember now whether it was you that was involved in that conversation?
I can't recall that conversation.
Can I come now to the 14th of December in the morning and the briefing at Bilpin? You know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Is it right that you as a sector commander had travelled with the crews that were, well, I would draw that, I assume you were at that briefing, is that correct?
That's correct.
And the crews that you were going to be in charge of, were they also at the briefing?
Yes.
And they were local crews, so a Mount Wilson crew and then a Mount Tomar crew and another local crew, is that right?
And a Bell crew.
And a Bell crew. And so in terms of the briefing, Mr. Carter undertook the briefing, is that right?
That's correct.
And is does the way the briefing work is that he has the IAP and speaks to the IAP and hands it out to relevant people within the team that's going to be undertaking those operations?
That's how it works.
And do you recall you were asked you were taken by council assisting to the Bell subdivision incident action plan for the morning of the 14th of December in the questions earlier this morning?
Yes.
And that had within it that there was, essentially it had a plan, namely to burn from Bell's line of road intersection with Mount Wilson towards Mount Wilson. And it also had identified an October sector north, which was to come down from Defore's Lookout back towards the intersection of Bell's line of road. Do you remember that that was in the plan?
That was in the plan. That was the first time I'd seen that plan.
But if you assume that that was the incident action plan, which was that had been prepared the evening before and was what Mr. Carter and others were working upon, it's likely, isn't it, that that was the plan that was provided to you that morning?
That was, but the problem with that plan was because it wasn't done with our involvement, and the plan had the sector boss being Peter Rains for the October North sector, when he had been put as a night crew for taking over from me at the end of my shift.
I understand that that's what you've identified as the flaw in that plan. But from, it indicates though to you that at least Mr. Carter was aware that at some stage that there would need to be a burn back from Defore's Lookout downhill to meet up with the backburn that was coming from the intersection.
Obviously, it was in the plan.
And ultimately, what was attempted to be implemented but then got frustrated by the spot over was your team burning down from Defore's Lookout to meet up with the backburn coming from the intersection.
But it was at my insistence. I wasn't getting any direction from the DivCom about when that was likely to start or the timing. I had to initiate that.
But you don't know, well, you know that you initiated it, but sitting here today, you're not sure when Mr. Carter, Mr. Carter, when it was in his mind to initiate it.
I had no idea.
And your evidence, at the time you did go off to become essentially the Northern October sector leader, and you left the fire ground, I think, sorry, I'll draw that, at about 2 or a little bit after, that's when you went back to the Mount Wilson Fire Brigade station, is that right?
That's correct.
And you'd briefed...
By that stage...
Oh, sorry, go on.
By that stage, the backburn had already progressed at least halfway along Mount Wilson Road. And so something had to be done about getting the fire safely off Mount Wilson to join up onto that backburn. It was going to be a very technical, hard burn to implement because it was very steep with a number of switchbacks. It would have taken a long time to implement. That's the burn coming down off the mountain.
I see. And but you were able to move from your position with a view to undertaking that burn you've just mentioned, because there had been a plan to bring in a swing shift which arrived shortly after midday.
Yes.
And-
Well, they arrived.
Sorry, that they arrived, and that's what enabled you to have the resources then to go and move towards that Defore's lookout area.
Yes.
And when you did that, you were, I think your evidence is you wouldn't have left that area if you'd had any major concerns about the backburn which had already been put in and went the risk of spotting and that type of thing.
That's right.
So, no further questions, Your Honour.
Thank you. Mr Wilcox, any further examination?
Yes, Your Honour. You were asked a question about typical time of day for implementing backburns around Mount Wilson, and particularly whether it was better at night time. Do you recall that question and answer? One of the limitations of backburning at night includes that you can't have aerial support. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms Rains. You're free to go now.
Your Honour, that concludes the evidence today. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. I propose to call Mr Jeff Conway, followed by Mr McKechnie after Mr Conway.
Thank you, Mr Castleton. We'll adjourn till 10 a.m. tomorrow.